Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to SIA Conversations, folks. आज मैं कोशिश कर रहा हूँ कि नया एक younger panel of experts. They're younger, but they're all well known. They, mashallah, achieved something. So we shall not say that they're any less than the others. They're all achievers. They've all done very well. We've got here Waqar Wadho. He's a professor at Lahore School of Economics. Got here Ahmed Pirzada, who's a professor at Bristol University, I think. And Saqib Sherani, who's a well-known guy who was the economic advisor to the Minister of Finance, runs a consulting firm, a think tank called Macro Insights, I think. So the object really is of this conversation कि हम लोग उर्दू अंग्रेजी बहुत जायज़ है that we should try and show the country what economists have to say. Because the way I look at it, economists are totally marginalized from policy. तो क्या कहते हैं कि जी economists are totally marginalized. Bankers के हाथों में policy है, boards पे bankers हैं, agencies bankers head करते हैं, central bank के board पे bankers हैं. So economists really are in a very, very small minority का थोड़े बहुत वो monetary policy committee पे आ जाते हैं, but that's about it. Planning commission में economist नहीं है, Ministry of Finance में economist नहीं है. And moreover, the SIFC and everybody is looking to other people other than economics कि वो हमें economic advice दें. तो मैं सोच रहा था जरा economist को हम बैठ के बात करें और देखें कि वो क्या कहते हैं on the problems of Pakistan. तो आज साकिब, वकार and अहमद, आप लोगों से हम शुरू करते हैं. And we are going to try and do this regularly with many groups, different groups, जैसे भी हो. I mean, it's all, as in my mind, there's no method. It's just evolving and how we can evolve this to show that what economists have to say. तो मैं यहाँ से शुरू करना चाह रहा था. आप लोगों से पहले ये पूछूं कि आपका क्या ख्याल है कि what do you think of this proposition कि economists क्यों नहीं होते और why are they not consulted? इसकी कोई systemic वजह है, कोई क्या वजह है? What do you think it is? Then we'll go on to the next question, which is about what the chief of army, the SIFC guy said at a conference, and the minister also, both ministers of industry and finance both said that the problems in Pakistan. So पहले तो ये बताइए, what do you think of this? Why are economists so marginalized? Ahmed, would you like to start, or Saqib, would you like to start? Go ahead, Saqib.
Yeah, thanks. I'd rather Ahmed started, but anyway. So, मेरा थोड़ा सा डिफरेंट व्यू है. एंड आई थिंक उस दिन हमने काफी मरतबा इस पे बल्कि बात भी की नदीम कि यार to be honest, some of the economists who have been consulted regularly for the past 20, 30 years have really sort of come up with very disappointing. I mean, I don't want to use the word BS. It's too harsh. But the standard sort of usual suspects that you've seen advising different governments for the past 30 years or 25 years, barring one or two perhaps, have said things like, for example, हमारे जो बहुत एक stalwart है, नाम नहीं लेता obviously, वो कहते हैं यार कि devaluation ने पाकिस्तान को मरवा दिया और रुपए जो है वो back of the envelope में calculation में डार साहब सही कहते हैं 250 रुपए का होना चाहिए. कोई और हैं वो कहते हैं कि यार imports को बिल्कुल बंद कर देना चाहिए. कोई कहते हैं कि एनएफसी अवार्ड का मसला ये है कि उसने पाकिस्तान की पॉपुलेशन बढ़ा दी है. एक्चुअली उन्होंने कैलकुलेट किया तो 180 मिलियन है, हम 250 मिलियन रिपोर्ट करते. सो यार आई मीन दीज आर द गाइज हु सिट ऑन द टेबल, सो आई मीन टू बी ऑनेस्ट, इट्स आई हैव बीन सेइंग दिस फॉर अ लॉन्ग टाइम कि यार it's people like Ahmed and I don't know Waqar too well, but I've been saying Ahmed, Ali Hasnan, यार ऐसे लोग हैं, इनको ब्रूड करें. ये they're the next level, next generation. मैं तो नहीं हूँ अब तो next generation में, तो इनका तो माशाल्लाह we should brood them and talk to them. They're sensible guys. They've done some serious work. I mean, I'm just naming two that I know. Obviously काफी सारे और भी हैं. And I am really impressed and surprised by the corpus of people that are available. And somehow we're not reaching out to them. So I think एक तो इजादारी है ना इन लोगों की जो पुराने हैं. I mean, they should have the decency to just step aside. Yeah? They should just retire now. At 80 years or 70 years, they have no right, no business to be sitting on the table and saying, they should be pointing to these guys and saying, "Kya inko le kya nahi." So that's my 2 cents.
Fair point. Ahmed?
I think I'll probably not बहुत ज़्यादा claim नहीं करता मैं यहाँ पे. I think I'm sitting outside. आप लोग बहुत ज़्यादा बेहतर जानते हैं. लेकिन I think just a bit of a superficial understanding उसकी basis पे मैं I'll comment on it. मेरे ख्याल से हमने जो economics है उसको we have reduced it as well to numbers or some key stats. Let's say आपने fiscal what is economics? अगर आप किसी या economic policy क्या है पाकिस्तान में generally आप जिस भी power broker से बात करें fiscal deficit ठीक करना है टैक्स रेशो को कहीं पे लेके जाना है करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट हमने कम करना है या उसको बैलेंस में रखना है इंटरेस्ट रेट्स ऊपर होने चाहिए नीचे होने चाहिए अब वंस यू काइंड ऑफ डिफाइन इकोनॉमिक्स इन टर्म्स ऑफ दीज की मैट्रिक्स फिर इकोनॉमिस्ट की क्या जरूरत है ये तो कोई भी कर लेगा आप उसको टारगेट दे दें जो आईएमएफ लेट्स से जो अप्रोच आईएमएफ की है नॉट देयर फॉल्ट जो भी उनका ऑब्जेक्टिव है कि हमने ये सर्टेन टारगेट्स हैं वो मीट करने हैं तो उसमें फिर लंबा चौड़ा आपको सोचने की क्या जरूरत है आप कर लें मीट यहाँ पे लेवी लगा दें वहां पे प्रोविंसेस का शेयर कम कर दें वहां कहीं और पे कुछ डेवलपमेंट स्पेंडिंग कट कर दें मतलब यू कैन प्ले अराउंड देयर आर सो मेनी डिफरेंट वेज टू मीट द टारगेट and then you meet the target and that's success. IMF आएगा या any again like I don't want to blame them but generally they'll say हमने targets meet कर लिए हैं और everything is looking very good reserves भी ऊपर चले गए हैं so फिर economist आपने why do you need economists so I think we probably have to move a bit away from these targets. I'm not saying that they're not important. I'm a macro person, so I'll be the last one to say they're not important. But still, I think we have to also redefine that economics is more than just these key targets जो आप meet कर लो, however it may be, and that will just get the game going. It's a lot to do with institutions क्या हैं आपके चाहे वो bureaucratic institutions हो, legal institutions हो, आपकी markets में frictions क्या हैं, you have to identify them and think about कि आप उनको कैसे address करोगे. So there's a lot else which goes on. It's about global integration, कैसी trade deals होनी चाहिए, नहीं होनी चाहिए. So maybe that's also a factor which is at play over here, but I don't want to claim too much, but that's my 2 cents.
No, both good points. I think that's very good. Important. कि जी एक तो problem ये है कि yes, the people at the policy table tend to be old favorites, and old favorites never seem to die in this country. ये भी है, बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं. और दूसरी चीज ये भी है कि we made economics too simplistic. ये भी बहुत जरूरी बात है, बहुत ठीक है. But let's now go on to the other question. कि जी chief नहीं मैं कहता हूँ बार बार General Sarfraz of SIFC, who's in charge of the SIFC. So basically, the highest ranking general who is involved in economics, he came to a panel and said, Kiji, everything is wrong in the economy. Taxes are too high. Interest rates are too high. Exchange rate is too controlled. And that somehow we need to change all this. Along comes Harun, वो क्या कहते हैं Akhtar, who's the industry minister, he says the same thing. Then comes the finance minister who says the same thing. जो मुझे हैरानगी होती है कि यार ये सब कुछ कैसे हुआ all the policy makers are saying this and they're giving no way forward. They're just saying कि ये खराबी है and they sort of hold up their hands helplessly and say ये खराबी है and they don't want to change anything और उनके पास कोई plan नहीं going forward. तो पहले तो how do you see this situation and how would you like to address this situation? Supposing you were the finance minister, how would you go about, what would you go about? First of all, let's look at it slightly differently. Chile, Pakistan is into the 25th IMF program and looking forward to the 26th. I don't think we'll be out of a 26th program. In a sense, we've never been out of a fund program in our life. We've always been in a fund program. अब क्या solution है इसमें? और आप बार बार कह रहे हैं, ये लोग कह रहे हैं, सब कह रहे हैं मुझे कि जी सब खराबी है, टैक्स पॉलिसी भी खराबी है, ये भी खराबी है, वो भी खराबी है, everything is bad. आपकी एक्सपोर्ट्स बढ़ नहीं रही बल्कि क्वाइट फ्रैंकली लग रहा है गिर रही हैं आपकी इंपोर्ट्स बढ़ रही हैं बैलेंस पेमेंट्स क्राइसिस फिर आने वाला है डेट आपका गिर नहीं रहा और इन्वेस्टमेंट आपकी फ्लैट है बल्कि फ्लैट का कम हो गई है इट्स ऑलमोस्ट प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट इज 8 to 9% of GDP पब्लिक ऑल टोल्ड इन्वेस्टमेंट इज अबाउट 12 to 13% of GDP योर ग्रोथ रेट इज डाउन बिलो योर पॉपुलेशन ग्रोथ रेट तो व्हाट वुड यू How would you like to look at this situation? Ahmed, why don't you start? Tell us.
I think इसमें मेरे ख्याल से इसमें एक इशू ये भी आता है कि before like हम यहाँ पे हैं क्यों और also I think maybe it's more meaningful if we say कि हमने कोशिश क्या की है या what are the things that we have tried and how those have failed. I think maybe उससे शायद there will be some way for progress कि हम जो try करते हैं उसको तो rule out करते जाएं. For example, with SIFC, what is the main story over here? If we go to the core of it, one is कि पैसा नहीं आ रहा. There's some kind of a financial constraint, तो हमें बाहर मुल्कों से जाके पैसे लाने, and we need to facilitate that. So that's the crux of it. Initially, the whole hype was around कि once you form this body, $80 billion आ जाएंगे, $100 billion आ जाएंगे, the number keeps going down. But the crux is हमें बाहर से पैसे चाहिए, which is implying कि locally पैसे हमारे पास नहीं है और इसलिए हमें उन constraints को overcome करने के लिए external investor चाहिए. लेकिन अगर आप डेटा उठा के देखें, let's say कि जो liquidity है उसके साथ हो क्या रहा है, तो I think you'll be forced to change your mind. अगर आप let's say one of the metric which I like very much is कि जो आपकी जो stock market which is supposedly the best of the best that we have to offer in terms of productivity or efficient companies out there, वो जो उनके profits आते हैं वो उसके साथ क्या करते हैं? वो around 50 to 60% of the profit they just give it away to the shareholders for consumption purposes or whatever further investment in other assets, outside assets. जबकि बाकी मुल्कों में ये रेशो कम है. अगर आप इमर्जिंग मार्केट्स की MSCI इंडेक्स के ऊपर है उसकी उठा के देखें, that's around 30%, US is around 30%, Europe में it's a bit higher, 40-45%, but Europe is also not doing very well. So the question is कि जो locally आपके players हैं उनके पास जब पैसा है वो भी नहीं इन्वेस्ट कर रहे, they also prefer consumption. So it's not so much of a matter of let's say कि पैसे नहीं है to get the investment going, it's more of कि for some reason investment हो नहीं रही या जो पैसे हैं वो भी इन्वेस्ट नहीं होना चाह रहे. और जो इन्वेस्टमेंट हो रही है वो भी if you look at the data from 2000 onwards over the last 15 years, you see कि जो companies की जो books हैं, the investment they are holding more and more of their assets in financial assets or real estate or those places. So productive investments का share जो है वो भी squeeze हो रहा है. So पहली तो हमें I think the important thing to take away is कि it's not so much of a problem of financial constraint कि पैसा नहीं है और आपको बाहर से पैसा लाना है. I'm not saying कि ना लाएं या investor ना आए, but there's something deeper over here which is even preventing your domestic players to invest in the economy and get the economy going. So I think that's one thing to correct. और उसको obviously what kind of lends support to this argument is कि आपने बना ली SIFC, आपने pretty much सारा कुछ आदमी के हवाले कर दिया कि ये streamline हो जाएगा. अपने वो लैंड भी उनको दिया ढेर सारा कि आप आए कॉर्पोरेट फॉर्म में फार्मिंग आप शुरू करें, सारा लैंड आपको हम देते हैं कॉर्पोरेट एंटिटी को, लेकिन पैसा कोई नहीं आया. So there must be something deeper over here which is wrong, जो कि आपको फिक्स करने की जरूरत है, rather than just going out and getting money or handing over everything to the military to get things going.
बिल्कुल. Waqar Wadho, what do you think? What do you think of this question? What do you think what Ahmed is saying? Okay, the problem is we don't have local investment. And why don't we have local investment? What has the economics research told us about investment?
Thank you, Nadeem. And sorry, I think earlier I was joining with another device and there was an issue. I might have missed some part between, but just to continue with Ahmed, I mean, investment and the constraints, for example. So I agree to some extent, actually, that those who can actually finance through, let's say, stock markets and they are not financing, this is one group of companies you can think about, or the one group of investors that you could think about. But there's a reason for it as well, because when you look at the structures of our manufacturing, the structure of our companies, these are not really productive companies apart from very few. Many companies that we are having are really too small to think beyond, to think about big investments, for example. I mean, you want to use the stock market, but you need to have your inbuilt structures that can actually help you upgrade your technology, help you expand, that you could think. So that is another constraint. Some of the bigger companies that we have are under the family controls, and others, they are in the different governments, organizations control, you could think about directly or indirectly. So I think one way of seeing it is that actually they don't have that capacity to invest as well. So that is the one point I would make it. The second is, like, I think there is big limitation of risk capital that you could think about. So I don't see, even like the smaller firms, they come up with some riskier projects or the innovative projects, where they could think out of the box, but rather they would prefer to go into, let's say, retail or go into a smaller business, which is not really innovative in that way. So that is another constraint that again is coming from the financial side. But I will take you all a little bit deviating from what you're thinking is let's think about like what the countries have done right. There's a huge literature. We got now like a 2 last Nobel laureates telling us that what countries have done right to achieve the prosperity. And then you can just simply pinpoint like what are the problems, or let's call them the structural problems that we are having. So one is, of course, we know from this Western prosperity is that they invested in the skills of humans. So we have human capital accumulation. We are failing in it very badly, I think. From any indicator that you take, we have literacy rates that are very low. We have college or university graduates that are not really trained for the markets. And you pick any indicator, actually, you will find the same thing. You think about the second lesson that these Western countries they give us is that they invested, which we were talking earlier, they invested in physical capital, and we already discussed some of the issues that are out there. And the two other things, one is that they invested in technology. They've upgraded their technologies and they are producing more efficiently. That is very incremental in nature. I can go in details about all.
Waqar, we seem to have lost.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we can go into the details of all of those, but then what especially the last year's Nobel Prize was telling us that there is something fundamental. It's not just the proximate looking at the investment in physical capital or investing in humans or investing in technology.
Specifically, Waqar, what is it? Specifically, what is it? What is it that you're trying to pinpoint?
So the last thing that I was saying, like there are the fundamentals. The fundamentals are incentive structures that individuals in any society.
So what's wrong with the incentive structure in Pakistan?
They are distorted. They start with the, I can give you example. Let's say think about the allocation. If you have, let's say, a few million rupees even in Pakistan, and you start thinking about where should you allocate these resources, there are huge distortions, and these distortions are created by the very government policies that actually incentivize you to invest in sectors that are not productive. They incentivize you to evade taxes, for example. They incentivize you to not to maintain your standards. So you can think about that is a big problem of allocation. This allocation problem also runs into allocation of talent. If you think about, you don't have returns if you want to be an entrepreneur, for example, in Pakistan, because the returns from other activities are way more. And then, of course, the incentives to stay within Pakistan is another thing. Our policies repeatedly, for example, if you think about, they really tolerate and let the inefficient firms survive. Those are by design, actually. A lot of policies we can talk about that actually let these firms survive, like in auto or like in any manufacturing sector you could think about. So they distort your incentives to actually invest in more productive, more innovative sectors and firms.
Haque. Saqib, how would you make this more specific policy-wise? How can we get to policy with these thoughts? ये इकोनॉमिक्स में तो हैं बातें, बट पॉलिसी वाइज पॉलिसी टेबल पे क्या कहेंगे हम?
अच्छा, मैं अगर सिर्फ दो तीन चीजें ऐड कर दूं. एक तो जो वकार साहब ने बात की उस पे इंसेंटिव्स के हवाले से. सी द अदर थिंग इज जो हमारा टैक्सेशन स्ट्रक्चर है, इट्स सो प्रेडेटरी इन नेचर ऑन फॉर्मल फर्म्स कि दे आर नॉट दे आर इंसेंटिवाइज्ड टू एक्चुअली इनफॉर्मलाइज, एंड वो इकोनॉमीज ऑफ स्केल में आते ही नहीं है. सो इकोनॉमीज ऑफ स्केल में नहीं आते हैं. देन वी वंडर कि यार वो छोटे छोटे फ्रेगमेंटेशन क्यों हो रही है मार्केट्स में, मतलब firms की, and then we can't attract foreign direct investment. Obviously they're looking for large players, they're looking for economies of scale. So एक तो वो structure. दूसरा जो अहमद ने बात की, मैं उसको सिर्फ let me just put some numbers. I did some work for Pakistan Business Council about two years ago on just on foreign investment, but just reinforcing Ahmed's point that there's something deeper than the availability of capital. So if you look at the, the good thing is that State Bank of Pakistan report karta hai inward FDI and outward FDI, right? So if you look at the ratio of outward FDI to inward FDI, it's, many years ago, 90s, it was static, relatively sort of flat around 6 to 7%. And now it's increased gradually over the years to a very large percentage. I think, mujhe offhand abhi yaad nahi hai, I think it's 20-25% in the last years that I checked, 2021 and 2022, for example. So the investment that's coming in is either churning, is there for a shorter horizon. It's coming into perhaps different sectors, jahan returns jaldi milte hain, or it's underwritten by the government through sovereign guarantees, etc. So something obviously is that this is not the kind of capital, the risk capital that we were, sort of attracting in the past, which stayed here for longer. This is actually seems to be a different kind of, different quality of investment. So, I mean, that's just one particular point, pointing to some more systemic and structural factors. The third point is specifically जो आपने पूछा वो ये है कि यार सॉरी एक और पॉइंट है एसआईएफसी के हवाले से आई थिंक उन्होंने ये भी नहीं सोचा कि यार ये जो हम बात कर रहे हैं एसआईएफसी पे ये तो हमारी अपनी इंटरनल कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस की वजह से हम we're pointing out our own internal contradictions of what we've put in place in the last 2 or 3 years. For example, the finance minister doesn't want to tax new people, doesn't want to tax the untaxed. He wants to tax the taxed. Right? And he doesn't want to stop the spigots that he's open for spending. If you just add the provincial and federal budgets, and I'm sure you've done that, all of you have done that, do you know what the total number is for FY26, the budget? What we're spending? 27 trillion rupees. Out of this, only 8.5 trillion, achhi kya, ab salary shalies add kar de, so we're talking about something like 14 trillion or 15 trillion is non-discretionary, right? The rest is discretionary spending. तो फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर साहब ने वो रोकना नहीं. जनरल साहब बड़े खुश हैं कि उनको वो पैसे मिल रहे हैं, यार ये इधर उधर बांट रहे हैं, वो पॉलिटिकल प्रोजेक्ट को अपना तकवीत दे रहे हैं. टैक्स उन्होंने लगाना नहीं है. And then they're saying कि यार ये policies गलत हैं. These policies are a function of their own internal contradictions. So I think ये भी एक उनको समझने की जरूरत है. And finally, I think the biggest thing that we need to worry about, and you pointed out that, you alluded to that when you said कि 26th program होगा. मुझे तो लगता है 27th program भी होगा. Because आपने fiscal austerity आपने accept की finance minister साहब ने without thinking through this whole thing. You're talking about a primary surplus. So if you use the standard debt equation with the kind of growth rates that we have, 3.5% maximum, right, for the next five years or whatever, we're in low growth equilibrium because we have a debt overhang. So hum fiscal austerity istemal kar rahe hain without putting debt restructuring on the table. So the entire onus is on fiscal austerity. You know what the number comes out to for the next 5 years? The primary surpluses every year that we'll need to throw up using the standard debt equation, 2.2 to 2.3% of GDP. That's the surplus. Where will you get growth from? So I think there's some fundamental thinking that needs to be done and hasn't been done, even by the finance minister, unfortunately, who's a technocrat. General Saab to obviously nahi karenge thinking, but ye finance minister ko sochna chahiye.
नहीं, बड़ी आपने सबने अच्छी बातें की, पर मुझे एक बात बताइए, जो हमारा सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है, आपने बात की डेट अरिथमेटिक की, विच इज वेरी करेक्ट. डेट अरिथमेटिक का जो मुझे फंडामेंटल चीज याद है, लॉन्ग टाइम अगो, when I did a paper on sustainable fiscal deficit for Pakistan, I think Peter and I did this in 1986 or something. उस वक्त भी निकल रहा था कि पाकिस्तान का सस्टेनेबल डेफिसिट जो है, डिपेंडिंग ऑन दैट इनिशियल कंडीशंस, हो सकता है 3-4% ऑफ जीडीपी. बट वो कैसे हो सकता है अगर हमारी ग्रोथ रेट इज हायर देन द इंटरेस्ट रेट वी पे आउट. ठीक है, अब स्टैंडर्ड कैलकुलस, डेट का कैलकुलस यही आ जाता है कि योर ग्रोथ रेट हैज टू बी हायर देन द इंटरेस्ट रेट यू पे. इवन इन अ कंपनी, इफ आई बोरो मनी, if I can grow my capital faster than my borrowing, I'm solvent. If my capital declines and my borrowing rate goes up, so I go into bankruptcy. अब मुझे ये बात बताइए, आप लोग सब बात करते हैं ये द की, मेरे दिमाग में तो की इज ग्रोथ. हमें, मेरा तो ख्याल है, मे बी आई एम रॉन्ग, we should pull out all the plugs, stop taxation, stop everything, and just go for growth. If you can grow the country for 10 years at over 6%, I think we might be able to solve many of our problems. So tax, etc. can wait and we can do it. But the question is, how can you make a country grow at over 6%? तो ये आप बताइए, is there anything you can do to make growth happen? On the number of questions that come out here, जो आपने बातें की है, सारों ने बड़ी अच्छी बातें की हैं. For example, spending. We must talk about spending. स्पेंडिंग क्यों नहीं कंट्रोल होती, स्पेंडिंग में क्यों इतना inertia है, it keeps increasing. For example, recently I did this quick calculation. We made 26 new agencies in the last year. पता नहीं क्यों नहीं एजेंसी बनाई जाती. अभी हमने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल कोर्ट बना दिया. आज मैं देख रहा था पार्लियामेंट की प्रोसीडिंग्स, दे मेड अ न्यू माइनॉरिटीज कमीशन विद अ कार्ट ब्लांच के जो मर्जी आप हायरिंग करो. तो यार ये बजटरी एक्सपेंडिचर तो लगते हैं ना, दिस इज नॉट अ फ्री गुड. तो एक्सपेंडिंग पे बात कर, फिर आप लोगों ने बात की टैक्सेशन. आई थिंक टैक्स पॉलिसी वी रियली नीड टू अनपैक. ये टैक्स पॉलिसी है क्या? एंड इट्स वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग. IMF अपनी रिपोर्ट में थ्रोज अप इट्स हैंड, सेज टैक्स पॉलिसी इज ऑल रॉन्ग. हे, दे वर नॉट इक्वली कंप्लिसिट. सो व्हाट इज टैक्स पॉलिसी इन दिस कंट्री? द थर्ड थिंग दैट आई सेड, ह्यूमन कैपिटल की वकार ने बात की. आई ऑल्सो लाइक टू टेक अप ह्यूमन कैपिटल क्या होता है, ठीक है ना? What is human capital? The fourth thing that relates to expenditures also is I'd also like to take up PSTP. कि PSTP भी अभी अनाउंस हो गया कि पार्लियामेंटेरियंस को पता नहीं कितने खर्चे मिल गए that they can spend at discretion, which is quite amazing. उसके साथ ही अभी आ रही है एक और चीज कि जी we are going to do 22 provinces. और अगर 22 provinces बन गए तो God knows fiscal expenditures क्या होंगे, तो भी हमें देखना चाहिए. So there are so many questions that come up, but let's take the growth question. हाँ, एक और भी आ जाता है क्वेश्चन जो अभी बात की थी अहमद ने और वकार ने, which is also very important. Risk capital. I want to focus on the term risk, which I'll focus with you later. What is the country risk in Pakistan? इस पे बाद में बात करते हैं, पहले ग्रोथ पे बताइए. What would you guys like to do on growth?
Anyone can go or yeah.
Go ahead, Waqar. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so I think that was the focus of my point as well, and I totally agree. I think there are not, I mean, I don't find any example from anywhere in the world that you achieve the prosperity without achieving those episodes of faster growth. And faster growth, I mean, you are even conservative thinking about the 6%, but the countries that have achieved, these are in 2 digits, often like including the most recent of the China. I don't see there is any other way than focusing on growth, and that should be the goal. And you know, I think in a way we are lucky because we are starting too behind. So that's what the growth theory and all the macroeconomics teaches us, that you have a big potential to accumulate, you have big potential to actually upgrade your technology because you are starting really farther away from everything. There are very low hanging fruits that we should actually be targeting, and we might start, for example, doing that. So one of this is that whenever you talk about the growth differences, one thing comes in is, you know, there is how the resources are allocated. So you can take the major sectors that you are thinking about. Let's say in Pakistan, if you got some resources, how the resources are distributed among the sectors. And we have seen in most of these success stories that the initial impulse or initial push that they get is when the resources move from relatively unproductive sectors to more productive sectors. And that is one thing that I think they can do, is to really, if you have to do the tax policy, if you have to do any incentive policy, is to incentivize those sectors where there is more productivity, even bad, but that manufacturing could do it. Your services sector, high-end service sector can do it. Your retail sector cannot do it. Your real estate sector cannot do it, for example.
Yeah, Waqar, I don't agree with you there.
Yeah.
आप क्यों कह रहे, why are you sector picking? What I learned was sector picking is not really the economist's job. It's the entrepreneur's job.
No, I think, okay, I slightly disagree. I recall long time back, we had a conversation with Ahmed also about that. I don't know if he recalls or not. So it's not, so you are not starting from the equilibrium where we are in a capitalist system and we want government to actually pick. Government is already picking. So what I'm saying is that pick the right guys. So we are de facto under the industrial policy which is bad. the industrial policy which is not written, the industrial policy which is a discretion. So what I'm saying is that come up with the industrial policy that has some well-defined goals, and the goals are that we are targeting high productivity and we are targeting growth. That's what I'm saying. So otherwise I agree, like if they don't have capacity to do it, which I'm being nicer to say it, then of course that will not work. And if they don't have intentions, which you think about the capture or anything else or rent seeking, then they will not be picking those sectors also. But so that is the low-hanging kind of.
You're looking for an industrial policy.
I do.
What is industrial policy, Ahmed, if it's not giving subsidies to your favorites? And can you pick sectors, Ahmed? Why is it that retail is less productive than cotton textile? Or why is real estate is less productive than, after all, look at all the economies in the world, they've been made on real estate. Real estate is the first thing that develops anywhere in the world. Even today, the US has a leading indicator of real estate development.
I think if I come in, I'll probably I want to say from a different perspective. I think one of the issue I'll probably say that is कि policy, industrial policy जो भी आप इसको कह लें, it's very much about उसको subsidy दे दो, उसको tax advantage दे दो, वहाँ पे tax लगा दो, उसको land दे दो, इसको मतलब it's all about the present. It's about कि आज हमने किसको क्या मरात देनी है, incentives देने हैं, और somehow that will solve the problem. I think पहली तो हमें historically I think ये चीज भी acknowledge करनी चाहिए क्योंकि every time you have a popular conversation, you have a conversation in the public domain, not in an academic domain. यही है कि मतलब फलां इंडस्ट्री को incentivize कर दो, एग्रीकल्चर को incentivize कर दो, उसको ये दे दो, वहां पे प्रोटेक्शन कर दो, and somehow that will solve the problem. I think पहली चीज हमें acknowledge ये करनी चाहिए कि ये सारी चीजें हम पिछले 50-60 साल से कर रहे हैं, and they haven't worked. इस तरह की चीजें, and we have pretty much tried all kind of combinations of this. आप कह सकते हैं कि नहीं ये वाला कॉम्बिनेशन ट्राई करें, इसको इसके साथ मिक्स करके एक नई कॉकटेल बनाएं और वो somehow it will deliver. I think जो चीज हमें मे बी फोकस करनी चाहिए जिस पे कम बात होती है वो है मेरे ख्याल से इंस्टीट्यूशंस. अगर किसी बंदे ने 500 मिलियन बिलियन की इन्वेस्टमेंट करनी है, चाहे वो लोकल है या चाहे वो फॉरेनर है, उसने आज का नहीं सोचना कि आज उसको क्या मरात मिल रही है. दैट्स अ वेरी शॉर्ट टर्म प्रॉब्लम. उसने सोचना है कि अगले 10 साल 15 साल 20 साल में क्या एनवायरनमेंट होगा जिसके अंदर मैंने ऑपरेट करना है, क्या वो कंपैरेटिव एनवायरनमेंट होगा, क्या इंस्टीट्यूशन जो है वो सर्टेनिटी ग्रांट करते हैं मुझे यहाँ पे ऑपरेट करने के लिए या नहीं ऑपरेट करने के लिए ग्रांट करते हैं, क्या लीगल स्ट्रक्चर जो है वो स्ट्रांग इनफ है कि अगर कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट अराइज करेगा तो उस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट को पीसफुली विदाउट एनी लेट्स से हायर ट्रांजैक्शन कॉस्ट उस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट को रिजॉल्व किया जा सकता है या नहीं किया जा सकता. अगर आप let's say अगर हम चाइना, there's a lot more obviously, I don't want to discount any of those other things which are obviously important, but just to make the point, अगर आप चाइना की एग्जांपल देखें या दुबई की एग्जांपल देखें, what is one of the things that they did? They actually provided an environment जहाँ पे legal structure was very strong, चाहे वो एक आप कह लें इंडस्ट्रियल स्टेट कह लें या वो दुबई में जो उनका सेंट्रल डिस्ट्रिक्ट है, whatever the name is, so they have those legal structures which are credible and which are up to date to the modern requirements of the business. जब तक आप वो certainty provide नहीं करते, it's not gonna work. Or that's also my biggest criticism of SIFC, apart from that there's military in there, that was what you have kind of done. You have essentially taken, हम ये नहीं कि argument ये नहीं है कि हमारे पास जो पहले institution थे वो कोई बहुत ज्यादा यहाँ पे कोई growth deliver कर रहे थे या बड़े efficient थे. But you have actually gone in the opposite direction. Rather than improving them, you have actually ended up creating even more uncertainty in the system. कि अगर मैं किसी को जानता हूँ, I'll get the benefits and the perks and the privileges. It's a short-term story and somehow that will incentivize me to work. आप मुझे आज दे भी दें, who knows, कल कोई और आपको पसंद आ जाएगा, आप उसको मेरे से ज्यादा बेहतर incentives दे देंगे, तो मेरा तो सारा का सारा business model गया. So with that kind of uncertainty, with that kind of lack of commitment in the system, which you have only increased, which was already bad because of this intervention, it's not going to work. It's only going to make things horrible. So you have to actually go and think about these institutions in a way which improves them, which brings that credibility, not just improves them, but also has a commitment device which kind of makes them, like, makes people certain for the next 15 years or 20 years or so. So I think when we talk about, and then there's obviously a lot of research out there as well. काफी लोगों ने इस पे बात की है कि अगर if you want to engage in more complex production, आपको let's say 20 बंदों से interact करना है in order to do your own thing, because it's a very complex production process, whether that's services or goods. So you need a lot of contracting, you need a lot of certainty, you need a lot of institutions with conflict resolution. So there's no way to grow or to industrialize the way we talk about industrialization into today's world without giving a focus to this aspect of how we run our country and just solely focusing on short-term, present, time zero की जो incentives हैं.
बिल्कुल ठीक अहमद, आप ले आए बात इंस्टीट्यूशंस पे एंड थिंकिंग लॉन्ग टर्म. हमारा IMF प्रोग्राम 3 साल का होता है, हम 3 महीने का सोचते हैं बिकॉज रिव्यू 3 महीने में होता है. IMF भी 3 महीने में सोचता है. प्लानिंग कमीशन मर चुकी है. साकिब साहब आप बताइए आपका क्या ख्याल है जो बातें कर रहे हैं. मुझे कोई स्पेसिफिक चीज़ें बताएं जो कि SIFC के जनरलों को भी समझ आए और वो कहे हाँ यार ये इकोनॉमिस्ट को काम की बातें करते हैं.
पहले तो मैं सॉरी एक मैं कैविएट कह दूं. आई थिंक मैंने I used the wrong term when I was talking about the inward FDI, and so I wasn't talking about the outward FDI. I was talking about the outflows associated with the
inflow, मतलब net inflow.
Exactly. So the outflows have increased steadily, versus the inflows, which means that people are repatriating or they're here or they're churning. Right. Yeah. Anyway, so the other thing is that, part of that publication that I spoke about, usme we looked at the number of instances where Pakistan was taken to the international settlement or arbitration of disputes, right? ICS ID jo hai, World Bank.
Yeah.
22 or 24 times. The highest number for any country. Now, on a smaller base of people coming into Pakistan, the highest number of disputes and arbitration proceedings against Pakistan, right? So that just shows वो जो अहमद बात कर रहे थे ना कि यार इतनी unstable environment है, policy environment हमने बनाई हुई है. Forget the political environment, forget the macroeconomic environment, the geopolitical environment. Policy environment itनी unstable है कि you'll never be able to get, especially now after. We're going after the IPPs the way we are going, coercive तरीके से we are justifying कि यार उनको कमरे में बंद करके उनको coerce कर रहे हैं कि यार आप यहाँ से you won't be able to walk out of this room if you don't sign on this paper or whatever. So this gets telegraphed. This gets talked about. You cannot hide these things in today's environment in closed doors, and we've done the worst possible PR for a long period of time for this kind of investment. So to be honest, मैं तो जो टेबल पे डालूंगा चीज ग्रोथ के हवाले से भी लिंक ही करती है और जो मैंने पीछे बात की थी वो ये है मेरे नजदीक the only way to jumpstart the economy from where we are right now. See, आपने ग्रोथ की बात की बड़ी अच्छी की, बट इनिशियल कंडीशंस को भी आपने मद्देनजर रखना है. पहली बात है, it is a fact that Pakistan's growth is balance of payments constrained. Right, so the ADB says 3.8% to 4% growth hoti hai, you have a balance of payments crisis anytime you exceed this. Right, so there is a certain envelope. So hoping for 6-8%, 10%, 12% growth is right now something that obviously you need to think more deeply about. How will you achieve that without avoiding a balance of payments crisis initially? And secondly, initial conditions, unfortunately, a debt overhang bhi hai, right? So we have a sovereign debt overhang that we need to. So the way I see, the way out of this impasse, the first thing that we should have put on the table with the IMF is that we need both. And I know this is really contrarian, Ahmed, will say whether he supports it or not, but I know his position on this. We've discussed this in the past as well. But mere nazdeek,
look, the more discussion, the better. So don't worry about it. We should oppose each other. We should not always be together. बताइए.
हाँ, तो वो खुद ही बताएगा उसकी क्या पोजीशन है. But मेरे नजदीक आपको external debt तो है ही है, but domestic debt की restructuring की बात करनी. You have to put it on the table. That will unfreeze fiscal space for the government. That then can be used, assuming if there is good governance, then somehow that can be used to unlock or unfreeze the growth dynamic.
Yeah, what does domestic debt restructuring mean? I think the only form of domestic debt restructuring that I know is inflation. कि आप 100% इन्फ्लेशन या डोमेस्टिक डेट खत्म हो गया तो इन्फ्लेशन की आप बात कर रहे हैं या क्या बात कर रहे हैं?
I mean, that's a standard theory. You're absolutely
Okay,
right.
fair
But
enough.
that doesn't give, yeah. So what that does basically is it just chips away your debt to GDP ratio, right?
Okay.
So what we are talking about is actual budgetary fiscal constraints. So you tell the banks, you talk about, basically this involves financial repression. You tell the banks, we cannot pay you 22% policy rates, or based on T-bills based on 22% or whatever. We're going to pay you back to the days of the 1990s, if you recall, where you borrowed from the central bank at a fixed 6%. So for a couple of years we'll do that. That will give us saving in the budget, and then we'll take it from there.
So in other words, you're going to screw the depositors. In other words, depositors जो है बेचारे मार खाएंगे और वो फाइनेंस करेंगे फिस्कल डेफिसिट को.
It doesn't have to be. It can.
फाइनेंशियल रिप्रेशन में डिपॉजिटर्स मार खाते हैं ना.
यार अभी भी खा रहे हैं, अभी भी तो फाइनेंशियल रिप्रेशन हो रहा है ना. Look at the spread of the banks. What are the banks doing? The banks are screwing. Now the government will be screwing the depositors. Right now the banks are screwing the depositors.
Right. ठीक बिल्कुल ठीक है. अच्छा देखिए, जो मैं आपकी बातों सुन रहा हूँ बिल्कुल ठीक है, बट कुछ ये आप जो कह रहे हैं कि BOP कंस्ट्रेंट, बूम बस्ट साइकिल जो है, I find it bizarre. I mean, boom bust cycle is in terms of two endogenous variables. कि आपकी ग्रोथ चढ़ती है तो करंट अकाउंट खराब हो जाता है, रिजर्व्स गिर जाते हैं वगैरह. So there is some exogenous variable, a policy variable that's driving the boom bust cycle. It's not as if the boom bust cycle is naturally built into the economy. तो क्या आपकी रिसर्च ने कोई आइडेंटिफाई किया है ये boom bust cycle किस वजह से है, क्यों boom bust cycle आता है? It's not natural, it's not normal. Yes, economies overheat करती हैं, and yes, there are fiscal policy variables, Keynesian, standard Keynesian stuff that can be done. ठीक है, exchange rate can adjust, so many things can happen. वजह क्या है? Can anybody tell me why do we have a boom bust cycle? और ये इसका ग्रोथ के साथ ताल्लुक है. दूसरी जो आपने बात सबने कही है, बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट बात है, वी नीड सर्टनिटी, वी नीड दिस. अब अगेन आई गो बैक टू दिस, अनसर्टनिटी जो है इज क्रिएटेड बाय आइदर, इट कैन बी ओनली टू वेज इट कैन बी क्रिएटेड. आइदर इट्स क्रिएटेड बाय नेचर कि अल्लाह इज अनकाइंड टू अस, और ऑल्टरनेटिव इट इज क्रिएटेड बाय अस. तो ये भी आप मुझे बताएं कि ये जो पॉलिसी अनसर्टनिटी है, इधर उधर भागती है पॉलिसी, 24 टाइम्स एक्सिड गए हैं, या समबडी हैज टू बी रिस्पॉन्सिबल. जैसे मैं कहता हूँ SIFC फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर सब कहते हैं कि जी ये एक प्रॉब्लम है, बट नोबडी टेक्स रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी. ये बताइए, यू आर द एनालिस्ट, आप बताइए कौन रिस्पॉन्सिबल है. तो दो सवाल, एक तो हु इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल और दूसरा बूम बस्ट साइकिल, ये इसमें भी कौन रिस्पॉन्सिबल है. दिस इज टू एंडोजेनस वेरिएबल्स are related, ठीक है, but something else is driving it. What is driving it?
Yeah, Nadeem, so I will take my turn.
Go ahead.
I mean, on the first question, the two things that come in my mind. First is relatively long term, is that you don't earn dollars and you want to spend in dollars. That's the deficit, actually. So I would pin it point to exporting, and the lower base of exporting is the major problem. The second, I will then go to the short run, actually. It's what you already pointed out, is that nobody is talking about how to reduce expenditures. We keep on increasing expenditures, and then we are really thinking that we are going to manage not only the fiscal deficit, but also the external deficit. So I think for the first question, the two fundamental problems, if you pin them point, is like we are very uncompetitive economy. We are unable to sell internationally. We are not earning dollars, and our government is, on the spending spree. They don't want to reduce their expenditure, or at least even to maintain. That is the problem. The second question that you, what was specific, Nadeem? What was the question about the
My question was the boom bust cycle.
So the boom bust, I responded. So who creates uncertainty? I think in all this, we are forgetting about the main player, that is the IMF itself. So if you're running the IMF program one after another, and you are actually literally implementing the prescription of this doctor, so we have to ask the framework of the doctor that what is going on, that everyone says, even now IMF itself says that this is not right. So to me, I think we have actually given up whatsoever little capacity we used to have to think and make our own policy. So we have been just run often by bureaucrats or the technocrats that literally take, or they even give sometimes prescription to IMF, and we follow it. So we don't think through it. And you already mentioned, like, we think about maybe 3 months, we maybe think about 6 months, and that creates an uncertainty. That is one of the major reasons for the uncertainties. We don't have really that long-term thinking, homegrown thinking that this is my goal, this is my objective, these are the structures I want to put in place to achieve that.
जी साकिब.
Yeah, so obviously ये हमारा for some reason we never moved, we didn't have a growth model as such. So एक तो बड़ा ये था, ये जो countries जो 1970s onwards से 60s onwards से जिन्होंने growth किया, they had an explicit export-led growth model. So I think we missed out on that. We missed out on globalization 1.0. We missed out on globalization 2.0, and now there's probably deglobalization or whatever. So we're stuck with that कि ये model भी काम नहीं करेगा. So clearly एक तो वो indigenous capacity की जो है, जो आप भी बात करते हैं, वकार भी अभी कर रहे थे, वो एक उसका फुकदान है. I think ये planning commission अगर होती जैसे 80s और 90s की थी, तकड़ी planning commission 60s 70s में 80s 90s तक, तो ये शायद they would have figured it out. But like you said, and I've written about this as well, कि 90s onwards say the center of gravity, because of frequent IMF programs, the center of gravity shifted to the Ministry of Finance. And then first it was the budget cycle, 12-month budget cycle, and then it was a 3-month review cycle. Now we're stuck in that 3-month review cycle with the IMF. So unfortunately, I think ये आपकी बात सही है कि ये somehow we need to break out of this. And the only way to break out of this, in my view, is convince the IMF that we need debt restructuring, but उसमें moral hazard create होता है when you have bad actors or bad faith or whatever. So we also need to then talk about the politics of this. Because ये टेक्नोक्रेटिक सॉल्यूशंस हम प्रेजेंट कर देंगे, और मैं 40 साल से, आप तो मतलब 50 साल से कर रहे हो, मैं 30 साल से कर रहा हूँ, और लोग भी कर रहे हैं, अहमद और वकार भी इतने सालों से अब कर रहे होंगे. They get no traction simply because we perhaps giving good advice to bad king. So we need to figure out how to get a good king.
बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं. अहमद के भी बाल सफेद हो गए ये काम कर करके. एंड आई रिमेंबर व्हेन ही स्टार्टेड ऑफ विद मी एज अ किड, यार, एज अ यंग ग्रेजुएट. अब ये भी बुढ़ा हो गया, तो क्वाइट फ्रैंक कि क्या करे, मुश्किल है. बट अहमद, रिटर्न टू दिस, व्हाट इज द ग्रोथ मॉडल यार? ये हम सब ग्रोथ मॉडल की बात करते हैं. सर मैं इस पर एक छोटा सा कह दूं. मैं काफ़ी देर से कह रहा हूँ कि वी हैड अ ग्रोथ मॉडल. अगर आप गौर करें, मैंने पापा ने एक से इंटरव्यू किया था, और आपको महबूला की किताब याद है. महबूला की किताब में आ गया कॉल्ड Oracles or Paragons of Development. नई किताब आई है, उसमें महबूला is one of the 6 apostles of development. Is one of the 6 है. There was what I call the Haque model, महबूब Haque and Harvard Advisory Group model, जो हमें दिया था, जो वकार ने अभी कहा है, that we are dollar short and that we are investment short. And therefore, the 2-gap model, and therefore, which is based on the solo model, therefore, we should go overseas and look for dollars and try and make projects at home. And it's a hardware issue. We need hardware, and we should develop hardware. But then along came Paul Romer and my former professor Bob Lucas, who came and gave us the endogenous growth model. और जो आप इस साल फिर, बल्कि पिछले साल भी 2 Nobel Prizes भी recently उसी मॉडल पे मिले हैं कि जी ये hardware does not create growth. Institutions create growth. Creative destruction creates growth. Entrepreneurship creates growth. अब मैं आपसे ये पूछता हूँ कि हमारा ग्रोथ मॉडल जो है अभी तक चल रहा है 2-gap मॉडल. हम सीपेक करते हैं, हम अब भाग रहे हैं सऊदी अरेबिया के पीछे, इधर उधर भागते हैं कि हमें डॉलर्स मिल जाए, और हम यहाँ प्रोजेक्ट्स लगा लें, ML1 लगा लें, बसें लगा लें, सड़कें बना लें, पर हमारी ग्रोथ नहीं हो रही. अहमद साहब, you are the professor in Bristol. You studied growth theory. I'm sure you teach growth theory too. Can you give us a growth model? Do we have a growth model? Can we have a growth model? Planning commission बाद में, planning commission तो बीच में आप वो vision बनाती है, उड़ान करती है. But where is the growth model?
I think इसको let's strip it down. मतलब क्या है? अब even the boom bust जिसकी हम बात कर रहे हैं, I think I kind of increasingly, maybe I'm converging to where you stand. A lot of these things, I just find them rather distracting. The reason being कि अगर आप let's say solo model की बात करें, strip it out, आपकी underlying growth जो हम कहते हैं 3% है, 4% है, जो भी है, वो क्या है? That's जो आपकी productivity growth है, TFP growth, technical term. वो 1% है पाकिस्तान की, डिपेंड करता है कब से काउंट करें, और आपकी जो पॉपुलेशन ग्रोथ है वो 1.5% है, 2% है, पता नहीं क्या लेटेस्ट क्या चल रहा है। इसको आप ऐड करें,
2.5 के करीब है भाई,
2.5 के करीब है, 2.5 के करीब है, उसको आप ऐड कर लें, अगर इफ देयर इज नथिंग इंटरेस्टिंग हैपनिंग इन द इकोनॉमी, वो आपकी ग्रोथ है। सो बाकी जो आपकी है, ऑब्वियसली देयर इज कैचिंग अप, बट देन लेट्स, वो तो कैचिंग अप तो हो नहीं रही, वो इंस्टीट्यूशनल कंस्ट्रेंट्स हैं, जो भी मसले हैं। अब बाकी जो है वो सारा बिजनेस साइकिल है उसके अराउंड, वो 3-3.5% आपकी अंडरलाइन ग्रोथ है, जो प्रोडक्टिविटी प्लस पॉपुलेशन ग्रोथ है। बाकी आप कभी आप रिसेशन में चले जाते हैं, जब डॉलर कम हो जाए, जब आपके पास हालात बेहतर हो, तो वो पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी आपको वो कहती है स्पेंडिंग करो, स्पेंडिंग करके आप बूम जनरेट करते हैं, 6% ग्रोथ चली जाती है, और उसके बाद तो ऑल ऑफ दैट स्टोरी 6% माइनस या 0%, ऑल ऑफ दैट इज रियली फ्लक्चुएटिंग अराउंड दैट अंडरलाइन ट्रेंड, और वो अंडरलाइन ट्रेंड कहीं नहीं जा रहा, वो उधर का उधर ही है, अगर if that's not getting worse. The problem is, I think we are focusing way too much on boom bust, possibly. और जो अंडरलाइन, और वो क्योंकि उसका नुकसान क्या है कि देन जो 6% जब हम ग्रोथ की बात करते हैं, वो भी बिकम्स अ बिट ऑफ आयरनी, वो भी हम कहते हैं अच्छा ये टेम्परेरी मेयर्स के थ्रू 6% ग्रोथ ले आते हैं या 8% ग्रोथ ले आते हैं, स्पेंडिंग बढ़ा देते हैं, और उससे या बाहर से पैसे ले आते हैं, वो पैसे स्पेंडिंग हो जाएगी और ग्रोथ बढ़ जाएगी। लेकिन अंडरलाइन जो ग्रोथ है, जो प्रोडक्टिविटी प्लस पॉपुलेशन है, अगर हम लेट्स से प्रोडक्टिविटी की तरफ आ जाएं, उसके ऊपर हम बात नहीं करते, वो कन्वर्सेशन में हमारे है ही नहीं। अब क्वेश्चन ये है कि वो प्रोडक्टिविटी किस चीज, उसको क्या ड्राइव करेगा उस प्रोडक्टिविटी में। अब ये जो रोमर का काम है, ये जो उसके बाद अभी जो नोबेल प्राइज मिला है एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप, और इसमें फिर रिस्क का एलिमेंट आ जाता है कि आर द पीपल और द एंटरप्रेन्योर्स इन द इकोनॉमी, आर दे विलिंग टू टेक द रिस्क और नॉट, राइट? बिकॉज दे आर स्पेशल इन मोस्ट ऑफ दीज मॉडल्स। जो एंटरप्रेन्योर है वो स्पेशल है, वो बाकियों की तरह नहीं है, वो रिस्क अवर्स नहीं है, वो रिस्क लविंग है, इट्स अ स्पेशल पर्सन इन देयर इन दोज फ्रेमवर्क्स, जो रिस्क लेता है, और सम ऑफ दोज बेट्स पे ऑफ, एंड व्हेन दोज बेट्स पे ऑफ, इट एंड्स अप पुलिंग द इकोनॉमी towards the higher frontier or towards a better outcome. So that's the story. तो वो जो रिस्क लेने वाले बंदे हैं वो किधर हैं इस मुल्क में, या वो रिस्क क्यों नहीं ले रहे, या वो मुल्क छोड़ के क्यों चले जाते हैं जब रिस्क लेने की बात आती है उसमें एक। so I think that's really what we need to figure out, वो जो अंडरलाइन ट्रेंड, आई थिंक दैट्स व्हाट वी नीड टू, और उसमें इंस्टीट्यूशंस मैटर करते हैं, उसमें ह्यूमन कैपिटल ऑब्वियसली वो भी मैटर करता है, उसमें जो आपने पाइप में काम किया था स्लज के ऊपर, जो लेट्स से वो सारे सिस्टम्स और जो फ्रिक्शंस हैं, वो सारी चीजें मैटर करती हैं। तो आई थिंक दोज आर द थिंग व्हिच आर इंपॉर्टेंट टू अंडरस्टैंडिंग दिस। एक जो चीज आई थिंक विच इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, जब हम अनसर्टेनिटी की बात करते हैं, उसमें भी वी नीड टू बी अ बिट मोर केयरफुल। देयर इज वन अनसर्टेनिटी व्हिच इज जस्ट लाइक अ बिट मोर सिक्लिकल, कि लेट्स से मे बी गवर्नमेंट चेंज हो गई या पॉलिसी चेंज हो गई, और वो उसकी वजह से सर्टेनिटी हमें नहीं है। There's another uncertainty which is structural in the sense कि policy है let's say, लेकिन institutions इतने weak हैं that they lead to this uncertainty in the future, right? So उसमें ये नहीं है चीजें change हो रही हैं, but then the institutional structure just creates uncertainty. तो आई थिंक हमारा जो प्रॉब्लम है उसको हम अंडर एप्रिशिएट करते हैं, और हमारा सोल्यूशन ये होता है कि लेट्स से पॉलिटिक्स जो है उसको somehow we set that aside, और इफ में आर्मी आ जाए डंडा लेके तो दैट विल सॉल्व द प्रॉब्लम। या अगर हमने एक पॉलिसी अडॉप्ट कर ली है, उसको now we just need to keep it in place for a long period of time, and that will solve the problem. But that's a very different kind of uncertainty. That's not the uncertainty which, let's say, business persons think about when they think about 15-20 years period. और वहां पे ये इस तरह के जो टूल्स होते हैं, they don't really work. So वहां पे institution strengthening important हो जाती है। So I think, और एक और जो I think another I'll probably say one more thing other than institutions, which is I think very important to Pakistan, is market size. So market size also matters a lot. जब हम scalability की बात करते हैं, अब UK relatively speaking institutions में it's good, like we don't have a human capital problem here, we have like very excellent universities, even schooling system is pretty good. If you look at some of those rankings, there's a ranking out there for those kind of things. But there again, UK may be one of the problems that's often discussed, and I think that's a legitimate problem, is that the UK market is pretty small, sorry. So yes, we do create a lot of startup ideas, but then as soon as those startup ideas mature to a particular level, wo US ki jo firms hain, they just end up buying those startup ideas and then they embed them in their own ecosystem, or the people over here, they just go to the US market aur wahan se wo funding raise karte hain. So all these creative output which the Europe and the UK produces somehow ends up moving to a different market ki ye market bahut choti hai. So I think that's also something which is underappreciated in Pakistan, or we try to keep the economy very closed in the hope कि somehow यहाँ से industrial miracle निकल आएगा, without appreciating कि you are competing with the players in the global economy who are serving the whole global market, who are not constrained by a small market, और जिसमें industrialization की फिर capacity इतनी आपकी होती नहीं है. So I
तो
think
देखिए यहाँ मैं इसको थोड़ा सा टर्न अराउंड कर दूं क्वेश्चन को फॉर अ शॉर्ट वाइल कि हुकूमत की जो अप्रोच है वो ये है कि जी सीपैक ले आओ, कैरी लुगर ले आओ, और अब ये ले आओ क्या कहते हैं जो आजकल नई टर्म चल रही है जियोनॉमिक्स. मुझे समझ नहीं आती जियोनॉमिक्स, तो मेरा ख्याल 50 साल पुरानी टर्म है, बिकॉज जियोनॉमिक्स का मतलब ये किसी से बाहर से पैसे ले आओ. तो वो अब SIFC पड़ी हुई है सऊदी अरेबिया के पीछे. उन्होंने क्या किया, उन्होंने AT करनी को हायर किया, एक फर्म इन दुबई. उनको पता नहीं कितने $1 मिलियन दे रहे हैं कि वो प्रोजेक्ट डॉक्यूमेंट्स बनाएंगे, जिसको कहते हैं ना पिच बुक्स बना रहे हैं. वो पिच बुक्स बना रहे हैं. They are making a pitch book on shrimp farming. They are making a pitch book on agriculture or something. They are making a pitch book. Saudis को क्या हम ये pitch books देंगे और foreign investment लेके आएंगे. तो चले pitch books तो बन रही हैं. But what I think I would like you guys to tell me on is, let me just put this question to you. If you were to estimate the country risk, and supposing Saudi Arabia hires you, कि यार बात सुनो हम पाकिस्तान जा रहे हैं इन्वेस्ट कर रहे हैं, तो कंट्री रिस्क हमें बताओ इनका कितना होगा, हमें क्या एक्सपेक्ट करना चाहिए. व्हाट शुड वी पिच दिस country risk at? Is it going to be just LIBOR plus 2 or whatever, KIBOR plus 2 or the stock market plus 3? How would you pitch the country risk? Saqib, would you like to take a stab at it? What's the country risk of Pakistan?
Yeah, so obviously this is quite, sort of subjective as well. But so the one way to look at it is, if you look at, if you want a market pricing for this, you look at the credit default swaps and say, okay, that's roughly where we are at, maybe 500 basis points, over and above everybody else, and or where we are in terms of spread over US Treasuries. And we really sort of, it's come down significantly, obviously, default risk come हुआ है, but it's still 500 or 600 basis, 600 उसके ऊपर swap points के ऊपर ये trade कर रहा है. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is equity markets में वो equity risk premium पे, foreign investors look at that. So they look at the equity risk premium and then add on the potential for a devaluation or a depreciation of the currency, so that they take out the money, so that's pretty significant. Either way you look at it, Pakistan risk is really high. But I think even these metrics are probably, so obviously Ahmed and Waqar will probably have a more academic view on this. But, because I've worked in equity markets, I can tell you, this is roughly how they look at it. But I've always thought कि ये भी underestimate करते हैं, because वो जो policy variable, policy unpredictability है ना, वो इसमें capture नहीं होता है. So I think, maybe Ahmed and Waqar can have a better idea on this.
जी Waqar.
Yeah. So I think I agree with Saqib Saab. So it's really high risk, and the thing is, I will just add 2 points in it, that if you think more of a longer term, and you want to invest in Pakistan, risk actually increases, because apart from this policy related risk that we are having, then you add on the political risk and the cycles that we have repeatedly, and that is happening. So I think the risk goes many folds, I think, once you think about the long run. So the investment, if it comes, it might be again relatively for the short run. And that's what I think Saqib was mentioning before also, that a lot of capital then goes back towards those countries. So I think risk is pretty high for anyone to come and invest in Pakistan.
Ji, Ahmed.
I think, yes, I agree with Saqib Saab or Waqar as well. Like the financial market risk is really financial, like it's a very default risk kind of like. But then when you're thinking about business, or the risk around the returns, that's a very different ball game. That's different, right? So that's not the default risk that you see in the CDS per se. So CDS is important as far as whether I'll get paid back in the next few years or so, but not the other elements Waqar is mentioning here as well. So that's obviously pretty high. But I think
मैं जो देख रहा हूँ, sorry, go ahead, please.
So I think we are kind of talking about, maybe we should probably also say, or maybe ask you, because you have done a lot of work on this. So I think in a lot of what we are saying is pretty obvious what we are saying, right? Some institutions की बात की है, हमने market integration की बात की है, we have talked about risk and uncertainty. Fiscal वगैरह की बात की है, which increasingly I'm a bit more skeptical of कि how much we should pay attention to that. I think I'm a macro person, so I'll never say no. But then what I want to say is कि, like, why do we have the institutions which we have, right? So I mean, one thing you see is abhi recently the whole takeover of whatever kind of a democratic system that we had. The one thing that you see happening immediately after is bureaucrats start getting, there's greater allocation for, let's say, housing finance for them, right? The judges' salaries have gone up by I don't know how many times. Same for parliamentarians and the rest, right? So there's so much of incentives, or there's so much of this stuff happening to just to get the game going. So I think we probably also need to touch on the political economy, or the political side of it, that when you are taking legitimacy, or where does the system take legitimacy from? Because where you take the legitimacy from, then essentially means you will have to serve the interests of those groups where you are getting the legitimacy from. So अगर आपको legitimize, या अगर आपकी government चलाने में, let's say, bureaucracy is central, that's where legitimacy is coming from, or if judges are central, or the courts are central, then they will actually end up getting a lot more on resources, and the institution will just keep on remaining the way they are. So I think how the system drives power, or where it drives the power from, I think that's also, and then I was reading your article just recently, आपने Substack पे elites के ऊपर लिखा था कि which elites, right? So I think that's important, like which elites matter at the end of the day. Also, it depends on where the system is driving the power from. And then we can talk a lot about institutions and how that leads to boom bust cycles or lack of growth. But if we don't really touch on where the credibility or the legitimacy is coming from, we are not going to really address the problem of how this can be corrected over the long term, or at some horizon, perhaps. But I do want to from you, because you have seen a lot of democracy and governance structures. I mean, I wonder what your take is on this.
Let me see. What I've read is that there are about 6 variables that I can put into country risk, broadly speaking. Now, इसमें थोड़ी intersection भी होगी, थोड़ी वो give and take भी होगी, but yes, we begin with the CDS spread, बिल्कुल ठीक है. Number 2, we put in the equity premium. Number 3, we put in क्या कहते हैं policy variability. Number 4, we put in tax variability. ठीक है, tax volatility. ये भी 2 policy में आ जाता है, but I want to keep it separate. And number 3, policy में regulatory variability डाल देते हैं, उधर tax variability डाल देते हैं, उधर इधर हम डाल देते हैं क्या कहते हैं एक और चीज़ क्या कहते हैं वो another thing that I thought, anyway, 4 or 5 variables. If we try and quantify these, I think country risk will go well north of 30 or 40%. And that would tell us very quickly why people don't invest here. There's a huge amount of credit. इसमें 2-3 चीजें मैं कह दूं जो मैंने देखी हैं कम से कम. We did a very big survey of the engineering sector in Pakistan, these small companies that exist in Gujranwale, Karachi, Lahore, etc., etc. उनका हमने बड़ा exhaustive survey किया, और उसमें उस्मान कादिर did that for me. उसमें बहुत मजेदार सर्वे था. उसमें जो बात निकली वो ये कि ये सारी कंपनी जो है कि 200-300 मिलियन बैठी हैं, 3-4 जनरेशन से, एक जनरेशन नहीं. सैलकोट हम गए, सैलकोट में भी किया, सैलकोट में भी 200-300 में. These are big companies, मतलब these are big companies. The small companies are even smaller. So the 10 million, $5 million companies जो बैठी हुई हैं, which haven't grown in the last 30-40 years. जब उनसे पूछा तो 2-3 चीजें. एक तो उन्होंने कहा कि जी we don't want to grow, we don't want to become visible. अगर visible हो जाएंगे तो हमें मारेंगे. नंबर 2 उन्होंने कहा कि जी ये हमें ये भी डर लगता है, this is the only thing we have, we are too risk averse, we don't want to give up control of a company, so we want to make sure कि मेरा बेटा इनहेरिट करेगा. तो ये 2 चीज़ें उनकी थी. एक माइंडसेट था, दूसरा वो थी. बट आई थिंक द 2 आर रिलेटेड. दे डोंट वांट टू रेज देयर हेड बिकॉज वो कहते हैं कि मर जाएंगे हम. ठीक है. अब मसला ये कि अच्छा ये लोग इक्विटी मार्केट में जाते नहीं. इक्विटी मार्केट में, बल्कि इक्विटी मार्केट तुम्हारी बहुत थिन है. मैंने इस पर पेपर लिखा था लॉन्ग टाइम अगो कि इक्विटी मार्केट तो हमारी जो है it's 10% of GDP now. 10% of GDP, so it's a very small equity market. It's like a small African countries. Secondly, all our companies, we hardly have any billion-dollar companies. So I've been raising hell over this. Okay, we've got $11 billion companies in this country, out of which 5 are government-owned 5 are multinationals, which is artificial because they're really not our companies. Only 3 private sector companies are above $1 billion. Now, if you don't have large companies, I can't see growth happening. So I think एक तो ये भी बहुत बड़ा conundrum है that we'll talk about. But ये है कि ये जो country risk है, इसको कैसे minimize किया जाए? For example, policy variability और tax variability, volatility जो है, इसको हम कैसे treat करें? और फिर for example एक और जो तीसरी चीज़ है equity premium, क्यों है भाई इतना? ठीक है? और country spread जो है, क्यों इतना बनता है? अगर आपने ये जैसे अपना साकिब ने कहा कि 24 एक्सिट केसेस हैं, 25 फंड प्रोग्राम्स हैं, तो कंट्री रिस्क तो आपको बहुत ही बड़ा है. आई थिंक दैट वेरिएबल शुड आल्सो बी पुट इन देयर. सो समबडी शुड एक्चुअली सिट डाउन एंड डू अ पेपर ऑन दिस कि ये कंट्री रिस्क क्या है एंड वी शुड टॉक अबाउट इट. उसके साथ अब बहुत सारी बातें रह गई हैं, बट आई थिंक वील स्टॉप हियर. कि वी हैव टू टॉक अबाउट द ग्रोथ मॉडल, वी हैव टू टॉक अबाउट लॉबीज, वी हैव टू टॉक अबाउट एलीट कैप्चर, वी गॉट टू टॉक अबाउट रोल ऑफ द प्लानिंग कमीशन फॉर एग्जाम्पल कि लॉन्ग टर्म प्लानिंग तो खत्म ही हो गई, अब इट्स ऑल डेड, फिनिश्ड. We have to talk about investment, tax, GDP ratio, institutions, और बहुत सारे सवाल हैं. But I think we made a very good beginning, and I'd like some feedback from you before we go. Okay, do you think this is worth continuing? Do you think we should bring in more people and try and do these conversations? Because मुझे कई लोग कहते हैं there's a bit of a divide here. कुछ लोग कहते हैं they should be more academic. I think we can I don't think we've been less academic. We can talk popularly too. और मैं जो चीज़ लाना चाहता हूँ कि I've seen some of my best professors, for example, Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, Posner, ये Taylor, Kahneman, they all were capable of translating complex subjects to ordinary people. I think we should also not have this arrogance because somehow we can't translate our work for ordinary people. Seminars are different from this, and the reason I like this is because, quite frankly, my ambition always has been कि जी हम एक economics profession बनाए इस मुल्क में. Economists should also be a lobby. We've got chartered accountants lobbies, we've got engineers lobbies, we've got bankers lobbies. Economists are totally absent. So my dream is that the younger generation should also have a say in policy and not just leave it to 1 or 2 people, older people. But the way to have a say is, जैसे मैं AEA को देख रहा था, AEA had a say in policy. How? Because it is organized. Royal Economic Society has had a say in policy. How? Because it's organized. We are not organized. YouTube gives us a way to organize ourselves. I hope we can do that. So any last minute thoughts before we go? Saqib?
No, personally, I really enjoyed this, and I think ये अच्छा format है. बहुत ज़्यादा लोगों के बजाय 2-3 लोग and ज़्यादा focus, deep dive हो सकती discussion, and aim towards sort of the public, sort of shaping the public discourse as well, or informing the public discourse.
Very good. Ahmed?
No, I think this has worked pretty well. It's good to kind of also run ideas with each other as well, and then see who has what point of view. So I think I've enjoyed this session. So hopefully I'll be able to see more of these in the future. So
great, folks. Inshallah, we'll do it again. We have to keep it short, otherwise we could still go on for hours. All the best. Thank you very much. Khuda Hafiz.
Right.